Like I was coming like, do I have? When we ended, like, do I have somebody money? Like, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Team of one forgot the music. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Libby's Bookshop. We're very excited here today to have Bradley Tusk, who wrote Vote with Your Phone, and he is in conversation with Sasha Issenberg. So I'll do a quick intro for both of them. It'll be about a 30-minute conversation. We can open it up to a Q&A, and then we have plenty of books to buy. We'll have you seated here for some signatures as well.
Great.
So Bradley Tusk is a venture capitalist, political strategist, philanthropist, and author of Vote with Your Phone: Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. Before Vote with Your Phone, Bradley authored The Fixer, My Adventures, Saving Startups from Death by Politics, and Obvious in Hindsight. He hosts a twice-a-week podcast called Firewall about the intersection of tech and politics, and recently opened an independent bookstore, P&T Knitwear, on Manhattan's Lower East Side. So thank you for supporting local. This is great.
Great way to lose money.
Between the bookstore tables. And Sasha Issenberg is a journalist, author of The Lie Detectives in Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections in the Disinformation Age, and 4 previous books as well on topics ranging from the global sushi business to the legal battles over same-sex marriage to the science of political campaigns. He teaches in UCLA's political science department and oversees Politico's coverage of ballot measures in California and currently lives in Venice. Unfortunately, we had some mishap with UPS. They were a little slow to get to us today, so we do not have Sasha's books in the store right now, but we are available to order all of them online. If you want them shipped free of charge, if you want to put them up in the store, good to go. So yeah, that's it. Enjoy the conversation. And
Great.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you. I want to thank my minders at Politico for helping put me here and just tell you a little bit that we're have embarked on a big expansion in California, and encourage you to sign up for our Playbook newsletters in California Climate. And if you care about politics and policy in California, you should be reading us. Thank you, Bradley, for being back here. I saw you a year ago here with a novel.
For the novel, yeah.
And here you have a sort of combination of memoir and how-to and manifesto that you start with this description of this fight for Uber against New York City government, and this sort of realization that people could do things with their phones that affect the political process. Was that the moment that was the germ of thinking about voting on the phone?
I mean, I think it kind of came in a few iterations. So the first 15 years or so of my career, I worked directly in government and politics, and I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch. I've seen it from every angle, and I took one thing away from all of it, which is every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And there's a handful of exceptions, but in my experience, they really are exceptions. And because of gerrymandering, the only election that matters is the primary. Primary turnout is typically about 10 to 15%. And as a result, 10 to 15% of voters, which are sort of the most ideologically extreme or special interests, dictate who wins office and then what they do once they're in office. And so I was well aware of the problem based on all the time that I spent in government and politics. I think when I ran all the campaigns for Uber to legalize ride sharing, there was this realization of, the same people who were mobilized by us through the app to advocate for Uber and say, hey, I like this thing, leave it alone. I was thinking, like, they don't know who their state senator is. Like, they're not voting in city council primaries. But I think previously I would have assumed they were just too apathetic to ever do anything. And then what the Uber experience made me think was maybe it's just that they're not going to not take their kid to school on a Tuesday to vote in a local election. But if they can do it while they're waiting for their coffee or sitting on a bus or whatever it is, would they? And that's what ultimately led to the creation of the Mobile Voting Project. And so it's kind of come in 3 phases. So the first phase was seeing, okay, is the thesis right that if the supply is there, the demand will be there too? And so we took the existing technology on the market and paid for 7 different states to host elections where either deployed military or people with disabilities voted in real elections on their phones. Those worked, and it proved that, yes, turnout went way up. If you make it easy, like everything else we've seen on the phone, people will do it. The second was could you build really secure technology that can withstand scrutiny? And so we started a tech build about 4 years ago, and we are just about done. We'll finish it next year. I can walk you through how it all works. But once we're done, it will be free and open source to any government that wants to use it. And then the third phase, and that's why I wrote this book, is kicking off the movement to actually legalize this everywhere. Because as you know, better than almost anybody, people who are in power don't want to make it easier to lose power. And yet to make this available, we're going to have to pass this in every single city and state in the country. And so phase 3 is, building the movement, educating people about it, running legislation.
So I've written a lot about political operatives or lobbyists who are fixated on technological innovation, usually in a way that they think will benefit their clients or help them get better at winning elections, because that's what they do. Like, at what point did you make the shift to thinking about, I've not met a lot of political consultants who see technological innovation, think about changing the overall system or process. Like, at what point did you start to sort of make that shift in your mind?
It's that, I think in a weird way, I have a weird relationship with money, and I think that's what made it feasible. So I'm a first generation American. I didn't grow up with a lot of money. I worked in government. I didn't make much money. And then all of a sudden I made a lot of money, because when I worked for Uber, they couldn't afford my fee, and I took it in equity, and that became Uber, right? And I sort of, as a result, knew that I kind of had enough money, certainly more than I ever expected to have, and kind of felt like, okay, what do I want to do with this money? Like, one thing that I've learned is, like, ultimately, we're all searching for what can bring us the most sustained happiness, right? That's what we're all solving for. And for me, like when I started making money, I bought a few things. Like, I got really good Mets season tickets, and the Mets just made the NLCS, so I'm very excited about that. But
finding a brief moment before the Dodgers despair kicks in here.
Exactly. And then I kind of realized that, like, the stuff that does it for me is like feeling like my life matters and I'm impacting the process in whatever way. And for me, what am I interested in? I'm interested in politics, and I'm interested in technology. And I kind of realized, I think that this could be the only scalable solution out there to potentially fix the problems of polarization in our government and our democracy. And B, like, I've had such a weird mix of career experiences that I was like, I'm not sure anyone else has had the vantage points that I've had to sort of see this and do this, or made the money that I've made to be able to fund it. And so all of that led to me just doing it. And look, there's a chance that all of this fails and I will have wasted $20 million. But for me, it was worth a shot.
So you, was it 2018 was the West Virginia? Was the first time
Yes.
that, okay. And then 6 other local.
So it'll be about 21 different elections over 7 states.
What have you learned, or what has surprised you and by seeing this actually in practice from the abstraction?
I mean, what we've learned is that, one, the thesis of the phone holds, which is when you eliminate friction and you make it easy for people to do something, a lot more of them will do it. The city of Denver did a poll. People participated in the election after the election, and not shockingly, 100% said, yeah, I prefer pressing a button to going somewhere, right? It would have been shocking if it wasn't, 100%. So one is, that thesis holds. 2, though, is, you still have to educate people about it, right? So what we were able to do was fund all of the costs of administering these elections so that there was no taxpayer expense, and it was easier to get these different election officials to agree to try this thing out if they didn't have to worry about the budget for it. But it wasn't like we then had a separate marketing budget to promote it. And so the people for whom, when they realized it was available, chose to do it. But even for mobile voting to work at scale, I'm going to need, and I've already started these conversations, Meta and iOS and Google and all the different platforms to bug the shit out of their users. Like, hey, did you know you could vote on your phone now? Hey, early voting in this jurisdiction started today. Press this button to download the LA County Board of Elections app, or whatever it is. So it's still going to require that. So on one hand, all of the magic of the phone does exist. On the other hand, it's not Field of Dreams where, like, if you build it, they will come.
How, in the book, you make fun of people who raise the skepticism by, I think, comparing them to people who believe that leeches could cure disease. So
or you can call me anti-vaxxers.
Yeah. Okay. At that risk, like,
yes.
Let me ask, why do you think this would have such a dramatic? You say it's obvious, but like, right. My best read of all the research on what people call convenience voting, right? This moved in the last, like, quarter century, early voting, in-person voting, mail ballots, has been that it has made it easier for people who would already vote to vote, but has not dramatically brought new people into the process. What makes you think that this technological innovation would not just facilitate people who are already think of themselves as voters?
A few things. So one is, I think that that's definitely true of a lot of the reforms like ranked choice voting or open primaries or jungle primaries like you have here or whatever else. I do think mail-in ballots has had an impact. And for example, in 2020, because of the pandemic, ballots were far more accessible via mail and turnout did jump up meaningfully in the election. We'll see if it holds in a couple of weeks. But I think a few things. One is there's never been an invention like the phone, right? And we now have undergone this dramatic social, normative, and cultural shift where everything we do in our lives is facilitated by this thing sitting in our pockets, right? Our banking, our healthcare, love lives, all of this stuff. And that equivalent never existed in any of these other reforms and scenarios. Two, our country's never been this screwed up before, right? So the level of polarization and dysfunction is at an all-time high. The level of anger is at an all-time high. We have all these existential problems like climate change and school shootings and the opioid crisis that we're not able to sort of get anything done about because we can't come together on things. And so people's frustration is incredibly high too. And so I think the combination of everyone's got one of these things in our pocket. So 97% of Americans under the age of 50 have a smartphone. Even 76% of people over the age of 65 have a smartphone. And to be clear, we're not proposing getting rid of any form of voting. I just want to give people an additional option. They have it. They know things aren't working. They're used to doing things on their phone. And I believe that if you make it easy enough and promote it enough, they will do it. And the final thing is, in order to meaningfully change the composition of the electorate to move power from the extremes to the middle, the only good news about how bad things are today is we don't need a radical jump in turnout to shift that, right? So when you're living in a world of 10% primary turnout, if you got to 27%, which is still like a quarter of voters, it's pretty pathetic. But nonetheless, the fundamental base for the people who are turning out is so different that the underlying incentives for politicians to then say, okay, now the people that I represent who actually vote in my primaries do want me to get stuff done. It is okay. I mean, you all the time must have off-the-record conversations with politicians who say, Sasha, yeah, I'd love to be for this bill, but I can't because of the primary. I'd love to be against it or whatever it is. Like, I mean, you must hear that literally every single day, multiple times a day. And I think that's true. I also think that they're never going to put their next election at risk just to do the right thing. But I think that if you can align their incentives in the next election with the public good, all of a sudden you start moving things to the middle and getting things done.
So you're obviously a good guy and well-intentioned.
Thank you.
But the cynic in me would say, if I heard that like a lobbyist with ties to some of the biggest companies in America wanted to dramatically change the way that we're able to vote, sometimes by doing it on those very companies' devices, like my alarms would go off and say like, wow, that seems like potentially scary. How do you convince people that your motives on this are what they are and not to be cynical about the idea that you have some ulterior agenda?
It's a fair question, and some people who don't want mobile voting will use that as one of their arguments against it for sure. First thing is, this is totally philanthropic, right? I don't even own the technology. In fact, my foundation doesn't even own the technology. There's something new called the Free Democracy Foundation that owns it, and the point was to take it away from the point of, A, this is not in any way a commercial venture. I think people sometimes assume they're like, oh, we're trying to make money on that. But B, it's not even a nonprofit venture that I control, right? Two, the code's going to be made open source. Once it's out there in the world, it's out there. I don't control it anymore. And the goal is actually not to be that we have this system that then everyone is using and voting on. All we're doing is making the code available, and then local jurisdictions then either decide, okay, we're going to take the code and adapt it to our own election needs, or we're going to hire the vendors who do business in this space to do it for us. Either way, we're not part of that process, right? If I were an election administrator or something like that, I think the cynicism might be a little more merited, but definitionally I'm removed from the process before it ever gets to that point. And the third is, to a certain extent, if people want to ultimately take the one thing that could possibly dramatically increase turnout and therefore move stuff to the middle and let it fall by the wayside because they want to believe that there's some cynical aim here, like, I can only do what I can do, right? I am one person, and I can put my money where my mouth is and my time where my mouth is, and I'm doing that. And ultimately, if the world chooses to reject it, like, I can just do my best.
And since you mentioned the code, one of my ambitions in life is to die never understanding what blockchain is. But
And this is not on blockchain.
So you described that you were working with some company called Votes, and it was blockchain based, and now you left blockchain, and like most of what I generally read about like big societal problems are going to be solved with like mobile devices is somehow related to blockchain accountability.
Right.
Can you just like generally explain what the
trade-offs
are?
How it all works. So specifically, so when we did those 7 elections, there were 2 companies doing this in the space. One was called Votes. They did over blockchain.
It's spelled VOATZ, which should be criminal.
And one was called Democracy Live. These companies will still exist, so is called, and they did over cloud, right? And they're both totally acceptable ways to do it. When we decided to build the technology, I think we went in assuming we would do it over blockchain, and then ultimately realized that just the auditability and accountability benefits that blockchain could provide, we could get anyway without having to use the blockchain itself. Which because there is cynicism, skepticism about blockchain, lets us avoid that. B, in doing it over the cloud, we're using the exact same system that the FBI and the DoD and NASA all use. And I felt like there was sort of added credibility by doing it that way. But let me, if it's okay, take a step back and explain how this whole thing works, right? So let's use you as an example. Is Venice its own incorporated city?
No, we're Los Angeles.
Okay, so you go to the App Store and you download the LA County Board of Elections app. And the first thing they say, okay, is Sasha a registered voter in LA County? You put in your address, yes. Next one, is Sasha really Sasha? So the first thing is multi-factor authentication. So just like if you lost your Amazon or Google password, they're going to text you a code that you then have to input. Same thing here. Then we use biometric screening to figure out, okay, are you really you, right? So there's a facial recognition scan matched up against your ID in some way. Once they determine, okay, this really is Sasha, then the ballot pops up on your screen. The ballot itself is meant to look as simple and straightforward as possible because the goal is to make it easy. But some of the problems that you do have with paper ballots or mail-in ballots, stray pencil marks, hanging chads, which could have got us literally the wrong result in 2000, undervoting, overvoting, none of those are actual issues here because the digital ballot eliminates those problems. You fill it out, you check it, you double check it, you decide, okay, I'm good to go, you hit submit. 2 things happen. The first is the ballot is immediately encrypted. The second is you get a tracking number as if it were a FedEx package where you can follow the progress of your ballot all the way through the process system. After that, it reaches the LA County Board of Elections, and the first thing they do is something called air gapping, which means they take it offline. It's no longer connected to the internet, and they don't decrypt it until it's offline. So therefore, the ability of a third party to access it is severely limited. Then a paper copy prints out immediately, and it gets mixed in with all of the other types of ballots, the mail-in ballots, the in-person ballots, which are totally randomized and anonymized. You can track the progress of your ballot through the tracking number. It was submitted, received, tabulated, printed, so on. And because the code itself is open source, any cryptographer, anyone who knows how to do this stuff, can go back in and say, okay, were there any abnormalities? Did something happen? Because if there were, it would then show up in the code. And so the totality of all of that, to me, is far and away the most secure elections we've ever done. It's funny, I was at an event in DC over the weekend and I was signing books, and I was realizing in New York, where I vote, all you do is sign a piece of paper. And I was like, literally, the security of our system is the equivalent of what I'm doing right now, scribbling my name in these books, right? And so when I look at our system, because of course people are going to say, well, something could go wrong. And that's true, right? I think you have to judge it in 2 contexts. The first context is, what's the security of mobile voting compared to the vulnerabilities of existing forms of voting? And the truth is, there are always problems, right? A polling place in Indiana last year got shut down because the poll workers didn't show up. A polling place in Maryland got shut down because there was a giant brawl outside the polling place. Mail trucks in Colorado got lost and people's ballots disappeared. And I don't think any of those things were like deliberate conspiracy. It was just things happen in life. But 2, the real question is, what's the cost of inaction, right? We have a country that I would argue is burning, right? And enough people feel that way that a guy who describes it in those terms may actually end up winning the presidency again in a couple of weeks. This may sound overly dramatic, but I think that if we don't start fixing these problems, I'm not sure we're one country in 25 years. I'm not even sure we should be one country in 25 years if we can't solve these problems. And the sad thing is, it'd be one thing if Americans were truly so divided that we said we just can't agree, right? But the reality is the problem isn't that Americans are so divided, it's that the people who actually show up to vote in most elections are so divided. So take guns. 70 to 80% of us would say we should neither confiscate everyone's guns, nor should it be easy to walk into the store and walk out with an assault rifle. The problem is that 70 to 80% of people don't vote in primaries. Same thing, 70 to 80% of us would say we should neither have open borders, but nor should we deport everyone who's here illegally, don't vote in primaries, and so on. And so on almost every single issue, there is a consensus point of view, but it's not the point of view reflected by the people who actually show up. So that point of view is never heard. So my opinion is if we can sort of empower those people and make it easier for them to vote, especially in the elections, like the one election that we don't have a turnout problem is the presidential, right? So like we'll get to around mid 60s in a couple of weeks. But New York City, where I live, city council primary turnout last year was 7%, right? You could win a council seat with 7,000 votes in a city of 8.5 million people, and what I would argue is the greatest city in the world. That's criminal, right? And so, especially in those elections, if we can just let people be heard more easily and not expect them to upend their lives to go vote, because they're not going to do it, right? But just expect them to vote if it's easier, and then expect politicians to become more centrist if all of a sudden that's who's voting in their elections. To me, that's just following human nature, and I think that could work.
So you were doing this before November 2020 and January
Yep.
6th and after. And one of the things I've sort of seen is that I'm sort of wondering how the conversation on election security has changed that you're entering here. The people who seemed most invested in talking about election security were sort of lefty good government types, with my experience before before November 2020, at least from like 2000 to 2020. And they seem to have gone largely quiet because now the whole conversation about election integrity has sort of been poisoned by people and folks who I think are well-intentioned about emphasizing election security feel sort of cowed about being seen as casting doubts on the process, and along with the My Pillow guy or whatever. How do you navigate the kind of changing partisan valence around these things, and does it change the way you see who your allies are, your opponents, your coalition?
So we polled before 2020, and roughly 75% of each group, so Democrats, Independents, Republicans, all said if it's safe, you should be able to vote on your phone. And then after 2020, we polled again, and we stayed in the mid 70s with Democrats and Independents, fell into the 40s with Republicans. I don't even want to know what it would be today. So I think it means a few things. The first thing is, I'm not a member of any party anymore, and while we're going to run legislation in blue cities and red cities, blue states and red states, it wouldn't shock me if this happens first in blue cities and blue states. And I'm going to try to do it everywhere, but whoever wants to do it is where it's going to happen. So that's one. Two, I think that to a certain extent we're going to have to let Trump kind of pass through the system and process. And the only good news I would say about Trump is he really is so unique that while you'll see and have already seen hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Republican politicians try to emulate him, it doesn't work, right? For whatever it is, this guy has this thing, but he will be gone sooner or later, in my view, hopefully sooner. The third is, and I think you know this, but voter fraud is not an actual thing, right? So I worked in Chicago politics. That is as dirty and nasty as it gets. I've testified in 5 different corruption trials or grand juries, only as a witness, but still. And guess what never came up once? A single allegation of voter fraud. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, did a study. You know what they said? How many
93 votes or 93 instances or something, right?
Yeah, 0.0000506% of votes that are cast are fraudulent. So 0 is the answer. It's not a real thing, but it is a real thing in the minds of many Republicans. Now, in the states where we did do the pilots, we had West Virginia, we had Utah, we had South Carolina, because for them, military voting was really appealing. So there are some arguments on the right, and there's also arguments for people who were kind of mainstream Republicans before MAGA, where they find this appealing because it's the only way to get their party back, right? If they've lost control of it to the extremes completely. And so, I haven't talked to Mitt Romney about this yet, but someone like a Romney Republican might like this. But yeah, the My Pillow guy is not going to be for this anytime soon.
Do you think differently about how people who are dishonest about this will you? I mean, I had a startup company in 2014 that we did like real-time election day vote tracking in November 2016, and I think the company went out of business 2017 because one of my business partners went to federal prison on campaign finance violations. So we can talk later about
that
this.
Happens.
But
yeah, I've seen that once or
but
twice.
I think a lot about how if we'd been around in November 2020, people who were totally dishonest would have found some way to contort what we were doing to prove some point about fraud or manipulation. And I feel very fortunate that I wasn't doing this in an environment where it sort of became part of this dishonest conversation about quote unquote election fraud. How do you anticipate, because Trump may go from the scene, but I think some part of the conspiracy-minded skepticism he has fed is now part of our politics for the next generation.
Totally.
How do you think about how you message to a significant portion of our public that has developed these, whether they're sincere or not, like these fundamental skepticisms about like the reliability of new voting methods?
Yeah, there's a few things. One is, that's why we want to start relatively small. So my goal, I was on a podcast the other day and they're like, so will we be using our phone in the presidential in 3 weeks? I'm like, no, like it might never in the presidential, or it'll be probably a decade. But let's start with school board elections, city council elections. Let's see how they go. And if they work, then we can scale our way up to state reps, state primary, state senate, and then eventually maybe get to the federal level. So the first is, I think by starting small, that assuages people to some extent. The second is, the reality is mobile voting is going to get you definitive answers on the vote count and the tally and security and everything else. Like if you were, again, I don't think Trump would ever support mobile voting, but in theory, if he's worried about, gang migrants that are now somehow voting, like you can't do that if you need biometric screening to be able to participate in the process, right? And so in theory, the people who are the loudest, screaming the loudest, ought to like what we're doing the most. They're not going to.
Yeah.
I get that. But those are the kinds of arguments we make. But, I'm betting on one real fundamental thing, which is, and this is more of my experience in tech than in politics, but once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And what I've seen every single time is once some people say, oh, here's this better way of doing something that is much easier, they're not willing to go back to the old system, and it spreads. And so my view is I got to get the genie out of the bottle somehow. And if that's in 6 cities next year where we're doing school board and city council, great. Let's start somewhere. And ultimately, this thing, like I have put a lot of money into this and a lot of effort into this, but if this doesn't grow beyond me, it's not going to work, right? No one has ever built a successful movement of just one person, even someone who would be a lot richer and more powerful and famous than me, still couldn't do it on their own. I spent years working for Mike Bloomberg. Like Mike couldn't just on his own make this happen, right? You need a movement of people. And so my hope is that by putting all of this stuff out there, we can start to see that movement.
And one thing that's also changed in the last 4 years has been a real focus on election administrators, people who were totally anonymous before, and now, secretaries of state, county clerks, have been focus of threats, and the elections are finally feel like high stakes elections. And you talk a lot about how politicians are like the biggest point of resistance because they get elected with the current electorate, and there's no reason that they would want to in any way change that. But a lot of these election administrators are politicians too, or they're appointed by politicians. You've had some success. You write a bit about the Secretary of State in West Virginia, who was sort of the first person to take on a pilot program. I'm wondering, like, what your experience, how you see election administrators, what their incentives and motivations are, and if there's anything we can learn from that, as one has to assume a lot of them are going to come under a lot of pressure a month from now by partisan actors, and Like, what is that world like?
I think a few things. So one is, what we found so far is it's kind of binary in that there are election administrators who are like, this system sucks. I know it doesn't work, and I would really like to try to bring about something better. That's more the minority than the majority, but they're the kinds of people that have done mobile voting so far, and there are still a lot of them. The one upside of there being thousands and thousands and thousands of election jurisdictions in this country is, even if you get 10, 15%, it's still hundreds of people, right? So, but a lot of them, you're right, are governed by the same ultimate kind of incentives and fears that politicians are generally, and a lot of them are not going to want to do it. But, generally what I found with them is they just want cover from somebody else. So if the city council and the mayor or the state legislature and the governor pass a law saying, well, this is how we're going to do it now, then pressure's off of them. They're not responsible here. So I think that's one. I think two would be, in a lot of ways, the system that we're putting out there does give them the ability to show more accountability, more auditability, more redundancy, faster results, all of that. And also think about all of the groups of people who are currently disenfranchised. Forget about the fact that most of us don't vote in most elections. Imagine if you're in Tampa right now or North Carolina, you're not going to be able to vote, right? Because you're evacuated, right? Or you're stationed in the military abroad and you mail in your ballot from Kandahar and it shows up 3 days after the election and gets thrown in the trash. Or you're blind. And in the book, we have access from people like Mark Riccobono, who is the president of the National Federation for the Blind, where he talks about, like, not only do you have all of the challenges that are just so much harder if you're trying to get to the polling place to vote because you're blind, you then have to hope that the person that you told, hey, put down this candidate, actually then puts that person down, right? Civil rights. And Martin Luther King III has an essay in this book. And the reason he's a big supporter of ours is he sees mobile voting as the best anti-voter suppression tool out there because, in his view, the reason they want, let's say in Georgia, you to have to wait in these long lines is to have some excuse to try to turn you away. If you're sitting at home and you're just doing this, like, they can't do anything about that, right? And so I think there will also be election officials who are looking to solve a specific problem for a specific constituency, and that's the way in with that.
Let's take some questions from anyone here.
And there's more seats over here.
Yeah, come on in.
Solomon, come sit.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So it feels like technological adoption at this rate is a little bit of an inevitability.
Yeah.
As younger people age up, they trust technology more, they're more willing to embrace the phone. How do you see that sort of exponential growth against what you described earlier, which is like maybe alarmist, but 25 years to a civil war, 25 years to stratification politically?
Yeah.
Which do you think achieves escape velocity first?
It's a great question, and I think part of it will depend on how well we do here, right? So, like, if I did nothing, mobile voting will still eventually happen, right? Technology always wins eventually, but it may be 25, 30 years until mobile voting happens on its own, and that may be longer than we have left to kind of keep the country together. And so, without sort of self-aggrandizing more than I normally do, which is a lot to begin with, I do think that there's a lot riding on this thing. But my daughter's a freshman in college, and I think she's sort of a very good use case here, which was, she sent me a text the other day and said, how do I vote? And I sent her back a link to get an absentee ballot from the New York Board of Elections. And I highly doubt that she's going to do it because, like, when we moved her in like 6 weeks ago, they gave her a room key. They gave her a bike room key. And it didn't occur to me much later, like, a mailbox key, a mailroom, never came up once. Like, it's just not even a consideration. She wouldn't know what to do with it. But since we started this conversation, she checked her phone 48 times. And if she could vote on her phone, she would absolutely do so, right? So I think that, if we can empower the younger generation of people to start voting, it will make a big difference. And also, there's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in either direction. Right now, things kind of build on itself and get worse and worse and worse. But if we hit a cycle where turnout increases, it moves things to the middle, it creates incentives to actually work together and get things done, and things get done, people feel better. They have more confidence in their government. They have more faith in institutions. Better people run for office because now they think, oh, this job is not so miserable after all. I could actually get something done. And, kind of like in tech, we talk about network effects. There's a negative network effect that we're living in right now, but I think there could be an equally positive and powerful network effect working on the other side. So I don't know. I may lose this fight or, it may not be winnable, but I think it's just getting the genie out of the bottle as fast as we can.
As the device that you're proposing is the solution is also obviously the cause of the spread of rampant misinformation.
Yeah.
Do you think there's another way to layer in voter education?
Yeah, for sure. So totally. So we've been talking with a bunch of groups who do exactly that. It needs to be, and which we're trying to figure out, super nonpartisan to work. So like when I was a kid, I remember the League of Women Voters sent a pamphlet to our house. Some of you, I'm older than most people in this room. Eric, do you remember that? And so that somehow passed muster. And so if some version of that, yeah, absolutely. Like in theory, we should be able to register people to vote, tell them about the candidates, tell them about the issues, tell them about sort of initiatives, especially here in California, you got referendums all the time, and then let them cast their ballots that way too. And then there's even a world where this is now getting a little ahead of ourselves, but where in the same way in California, you have a little more of a direct democracy here because you do have so many referendums where the public is voting on specific policies as opposed to just for people who then make policies. I mean, you could have a world run by plebiscite via people's phones if you wanted to. You know, in my experience, your average person does not really want to have to like deal with like what should the water department budget be. So they probably would rather just vote for someone in the city council who could then figure that out. But there's also another piece to your question, which is how do we deal with all of the disinformation out there? And I would say that while I think that mobile voting is the best tool to increase participation, there's a lot of other work that has to get done, right? And we need to do things like, for example, repeal Section 230, which is the provision of law that gives the platforms just perverse incentives to promote the most toxic content possible because it helps make them more money. We don't have any sort of data privacy framework in this country at all. We need to have one. We need to continue being much more aggressive on antitrust. There was a great ruling in the Google Epic case on Monday, but that needs to be the beginning of a process, not just a one-off. We need a lot more legislation around deepfakes. I think Gavin Newsom made a huge mistake in vetoing SB 1047, which was the AI bill. And I know as a VC, I'm supposed to be against all tech regulation and, you know, for some libertarian tech utopia. But the reality is you can't put an idea out there as powerful as AI and both as, you know, as much opportunity and risk as AI and not give the public some level of confidence that someone's watching out for this thing and looking out for them, because we know from Internet 2.0, the companies look out for themselves. And you could argue that the definition of capitalism is such that that is what you're supposed to do. That's your fiduciary duty. But that's why government exists. And so I do think that while, you know, mobile voting is the thing that I am focused on, a lot of other stuff has to happen too, because if we could have an internet that is not such a toxic cesspool and have a way to vote that can educate people and reach people a lot more easily, you can get a much better society.
Yeah.
Outside of the political extreme groups on either side, who do you think stands to lose the most from more political voting in general?
Some, you know, it's interesting. Like there'll be some unions that will, I think, do really well with this and some that will not like it, right? So for example, the nurses union, we've had really great conversations with because they look at it and say, their members can't leave the hospital, I mean, and to speak this, to go vote, right? And so as a result, doctors and nurses have some of the lowest voter participation rates in the country because like, what, they're gonna let somebody die to go vote? Like, of course they can't do that, right? So there's some unions that will like it because it will be better for their members. There are some unions that will say, we're really good at organizing, so we'll gladly take on this challenge because we think it'll increase our reach. And then you'll have other unions like the teachers union, for example, that will say, right now, they dominate what local and state Democratic politicians do because in the world of 10 to 15% turnout primaries, the fear of them and of the CTU here or whatever it is entering a race is so overwhelming that no one dares cross them in the first place. If, you know, you're the teachers union and your vote share currently is 10, 15% of a primary, and then we triple turnout, it drops to 5%, all of a sudden you lose a lot of power. Or the NRA, you know, the reason most Republican politicians understand that it's crazy that someone can walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47. But they also know that if they have 12% turnout in their primary, NRA members are half of that 12%, they will lose their seat if they don't continue to oppose all gun control measures. If we got turnout to say 36%, the NRA's vote share goes from 50 to 16, changes a lot. So I think there are interest groups that clearly would lose power. There are, look, even when we're talking about Section 230, the reason why, in the 2020 platforms, both Biden and Trump supported the repeal of 230. Most members of Congress agree with it because the truth is it's one of those issues that cuts across partisanship, right? If you're a parent, you could be the biggest MAGA Republican, the biggest socialist Democrat. You're just terrified of what your kid is seeing on the internet. That's it, right? Like all the other politics kind of go out the window, which is why you've seen states on both the left and the right, Texas, Florida, California, New York, all pass somewhat similar regulations around this stuff. But the reason why Meta and others can kill it is they scare politicians and say, okay, you're only going to have 13,000 people show up in your election. And if I drop $2 million in your race, you're dead in the water. Guess what that does? It keeps Section 230. So I think there are a lot of special interest groups that are going to lose a lot by this, and they're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money opposing this and opposing us and everything else. And it's going to be a tough fight, right? And it's going to be ugly. But I also can't think of anything more worthwhile.
I'm curious if you're tying tactically like mobile voter registration with this movement as well, because like the biggest voter suppression tool feels like the voter registration piece versus the actual turnout piece.
Yeah, totally.
And like how you see that tactically.
Yeah, I mean, the two things go hand in hand. I would say, though, that the bigger, if I had to choose the bigger problem, it is harder to get people to show up to vote than it is to get them to register to vote. We need to do both, and we should be using technology to maximize both as much as possible. And the app that we have built, there's no reason why it couldn't be used for that. And I think naturally one leads to the other. And also, like, for example, we met with some people from Headcount yesterday, and like a lot of the work that they're doing and registering people at concerts and festivals and all of that are the same people that I need to fight for mobile voting, right? In many ways, this book is an open letter to Gen Z saying, listen, if the world seems fucked to you, it's because it kind of is, but there's also a solution to all of this, but you got to fight for it, right? Like if you just sit back and let it happen to you, it's not going to be good for you. The status quo is the status quo because the people who are in power do things to benefit themselves, right? So we're going to have to fight for it. So I think there's a lot of partnership we have with registration, and I think a lot of the tactics that we're using are the same ones we're going to need to.
Would you go to the extent of like the Secretary of State is like, yeah, we'll allow mobile voting, but like registration is going to be the old-fashioned way, and you have to do it by like October 15th or whatever? Would you
I wouldn't.
say no?
I wouldn't, because I would take every opportunity.
Yeah.
If a Secretary of State said to me, "We hate mobile voting, and if you agree to go away for a year, we will mail a ballot to everyone in the state," I'll take the deal.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to be opportunistic in every single case. But, ultimately, the people who are conceptually online with mobile voting will probably be conceptually in line with voter mobile registration.
So, who are the companies that make money currently running these systems, and how do you think they're going to respond to this? Do you think the incentives are going to align?
Yeah, they should. We've been Dominion's one that became famous because of all the Fox stuff, right? ES&S is another really big one. Runback, Democracy Live. There's a bunch of them,
and some of these are traditional election
these are
voting machine manufacturers.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's a horrible business, right? So like one of the reasons why people are like, well, you're just trying to make money. It's like as a VC, like I would never invest in an elections company. Like that's a horrible business. So the discussions I've had with them have basically revolved around them saying, listen, our only goal is to sell things to the government, right? And unless they're issuing an RFP asking for mobile voting, we don't care about mobile voting. If you want to build this tech and make it free for us to use, like sure, and then if the government wants to pay us to implement it, we're happy to do it. Until then, we don't really care. So I think that for as long as I'm taking on all the risk and cost, they're okay with it. And then it just becomes a question of the market either driving it or not. But we have had a lot of conversations with some of these companies around, like, listen, if the opportunity were there, would you want to be the commercial provider? And by the way, you make all the money you can. Like, keep it. I don't want any of it. Whatever deal you have with whatever jurisdiction is fine with me. So I don't think we'll get widespread opposition. But at the same time, like these are, one of the reasons that I felt like it took someone to do this philanthropically is these are not companies that have a spare $15 million to throw into an R&D project that may or may not work. And so I felt like if someone didn't mean me, but someone like me didn't do it, it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, go.
Hi.
I was just, you mentioned the nurses union
Yes.
in California, mainly in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
but it covered the western 13 states. There were big strikes in the film industry
Mhm.
because we had all the
Yeah.
contracts.
Yeah.
came in.
Yeah. Yeah.
All that voting was done online.
Yeah, totally. So I didn't build it for that, but same thing. So the same open source code could be used for union voting, student election voting, HOA, homeowner association voting. So yeah, I mean, I actually would like that because even though it doesn't really get to what I care about, which is sort of moving political incentives to the middle, it would socialize the concept with people and there would be value in that.
All the unions in the film industry, though, have PAC groups
Yep.
that send out. I mean, if you were to get the Teamsters on board with
Yep.
doing this,
Uh,
they're huge.
I literally had a call today about hiring a labor-specific person to go have those meetings. So totally great.
Is the idea to authorize this state by state? Like
Yeah.
start with California and kind of see it trickle down?
Yeah, so starting at the municipal level simply because it'll be easier to find 5, 10, 20 cities to try it out than convince 5, 10, 20 state legislatures to do it. But yeah, municipal, then state. And then interestingly, the US government isn't needed to have this happen in federal elections, right? They're all administered and decided locally. So like when West Virginia did it for deployed military, it applied that year in the congressional primaries that were happening in West Virginia. But I think we scale our way up because I think, one, that will help develop confidence in the system. And two, my hope is that whatever we put out there is not the final version of mobile voting. It's that other people take it and run with it. The other thing are other countries, right? So like I was doing an event in DC over the weekend and someone came up to me and said, hey, I work with the Portuguese government. Would you be willing to talk to them about it? And I was like, guess what? I'm weirdly going to be speaking at a conference in Lisbon in November. So sure, let's meet. And so, so I think there's opportunities for other countries, just like you were talking about for union voting. And so, wherever I can get the ability and opportunity to show people that it can work, I'm going to take it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Beyond just like the skepticism around people not trusting the technology, is there sort of an equivalent where taxi drivers were obviously opposed to Ubers? Is there like an equivalent of taxi drivers?
There is. So there's some groups like Verified Voting, Citizens Action. They're so DC based, and they're like the anti-vaxxers of the voting world, like paper ballots only. Everything is a conspiracy. We can't try anything new. So that my Leach's argument in the book was sort of about them. So that's group one. Group two will be there are cryptographers who we are working with to build this thing. There are others like Ron Rivest at MIT who have staked his reputation on that this can never be done and can never happen. And it doesn't matter what we prove, show, anything else. He's always going to be against it. And politicians are smart because they're going to hide behind Ron Rivest. Say, well, Ron Rivest says this can't be safe, so how could it possibly work? Even in places like Texas and Georgia, when they pass these big voting rights restrictions, they don't say we don't want black people to vote. That's what they're doing. They say security, integrity, all these bullshit buzzwords. And so I've got these local crazies that are going to oppose us. I'm going to have cryptographers that oppose us. And then ultimately, they're all both sort of useful idiots in the sort of service of the status quo that ultimately doesn't want us because if we succeed, then their influence diminishes.
Is your sense that among the security hurdles you have to demonstrate between anonymity, resistance to hacking, fraud, like what do you think is going to be the biggest barrier that you have to get
hacking?
Okay.
And I think that's also another argument for why I want to start locally, which is like,
make it a small target. Is that?
Yeah, I just don't see like Vladimir Putin hacking like the Queensborough president election, right? Or the school board election or whatever it is. And so, that gives us some time to test this thing out. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's it. Anonymity, we haven't addressed it. It's a lot like a mail-in ballot, in that when you mail in a ballot, it has identifying markers. It has your return address, it has your signature affidavit, but those are all on the external. And then when the ballot itself is removed, it just gets mixed in with everything else, and there's no identifying markers on it. Same thing here, right? So when you submit your ballot, it is from you, but then ultimately, once it is decrypted, it's just an anonymized piece of paper that gets printed out with everything else, so they have no idea which was Sasha's vote and which was Bradley's vote.
Questions?
So, ma'am, you had a question before. I don't know if I got answered. Yeah.
Yeah, I live in Texas.
Uh-huh.
And that's where the legislature is laser focused on making it harder to vote.
Yep.
And they do it brilliantly. And
Yep.
it's not an absentee ballot in college is impossible to get.
Yep.
But so the military is where I think you have a possibility.
Yeah.
In a red state like Texas.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I was wondering if you're kind of.
Yeah, I mean, so we're working with Blue Star Families, which is a military family organization. Mac Warner, who was the Secretary of State of West Virginia, still is Secretary of West Virginia, but he's termed out and he'll be done at the end of the year. I'm hoping will join our team, and he's a MAGA Republican. I mean, Mac is not my politics at all, but I think there's utility in having him as part of the organization. I happen to randomly know some of Abbott's people, and I have thrown out this concept to them, and it has not been well received.
Last question for you. So everybody will go home and read the book. Like, how, in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, based on your sort of idea of getting critical mass, improving this, like, what does success look like? If we're wondering 3-5 years from now, is Bradley like making progress on this, or is it stalled?
So
like
it would be
we
a
would
few
see this
things.
in a handful of localities.
Yeah, you would see a few things. One is you would see, hopefully in 5 years, dozens and dozens of cities, and hopefully at least some number of states where this is available to everyone. You would see turnout
in certain elections. You think
it could be? Well, I mean, honestly,
do you think it's possible in 5 years there could be a state that is using this for
all elections?
all scheduled elections?
It's possible, but the reality is, if it'll be easier to get it done first for primaries, and the truth is that's where the rubber meets the road anyway. So
in terms of impact,
yeah. So ultimately, like, and I think yet it sounds less scary to be like, okay, let's try local state rep primaries, right? Okay. So I think that if we could have dozens of cities and some number of states, and if in those places that have had it for a couple of cycles, turnout is increasing, that's what I think we could hope to achieve in 3 to 5 years. You know, this is in many ways a big behavioral economics experiment, right? I'm betting on 2 major social normative changes to happen. The first is that if you give people something that reduces all of the friction in it, the participation and adoption rate will be much higher. And then bet number 2 is if you change the underlying composition of the electorate, politicians will shift their behavior accordingly because they just want to keep whoever they need to happy to stay in office. I think they're both pretty safe bets. The first bet could start to see payoff by 3 to 5 years from now. The second one will take, I think, a little longer.
And is it bad for you if 3 to 5 years from now, those are all basically blue cities and counties and states? And like, if that,
No.
if it becomes defined as a blue state,
I mean, I would prefer that not to be the outcome. But look, if even in 10 states, all of a sudden we can get state rep and Senate primary turnout from 11 to 32, and that fundamentally enables more things to get done in those states because they're less ideologically extreme, that would be great. Look, I built this for the US, but if 15 other countries adopt this and they do it first and their democracies get better as a result, that would be great. So, I'm just trying to do whatever I can.
Yeah, one more.
How, assuming people in this room are into this idea,
Yeah.
how do we, if we want to make it a reality, how do we help?
Yeah, a few things. So one, thank you. Not shockingly, Jackie and I work together. So if you go to mobilevoting.org, you can learn how to sign up and volunteer and everything else. What we're really going to need are people in the cities that we're running legislation in, and I don't know if any will be in California in the first round or not, to be able to
when
get
do you figure
involved.
that out?
Over the next few months, we'll introduce bills sometime in Q1. I've got sort of a macro list. I've learned 2 things. So one is I've got a macro list of cities that we're working through lots of different research, but also what I'm finding, which is kind of nice, is in these events, like when I was in Miami, someone came up and said, oh, I'm the mayor of Miami Beach. I'm interested in this. Or I was in DC, someone came up and said, oh, I'm on the city council in Alexandria. So also my hope is that just in getting this out there, other people who I'm not thinking of will come to us. So that'll sort of figure out where it's going to be. And then the other thing would just be, if you can give the book to your friends after you read it, that would be great. If you know any really rich people that would want to match me on what I'm spending on this, that would be great. But yeah, I mean, we'll take any help we can get.
Well, thank you all very much.
All right,
Probably
thank
be
you,
able to
guys.
sign books.
Thank
Thanks a lot.
you.
I appreciate it. It's fun.
Thanks, Chip.
Thank you very much. We'll keep you stationed
Okay.
here. We have plenty of books to purchase. I will be right back.
When's your new book coming
Thank you
out?
all for coming.
Oh, my last one was 6 months ago, and I'm hoping to take a proposal out after the election.